All right, so round two.
Yes.
Having some technical difficulties, so trying this again on Twitter Live.
Perfect day, sort of a 2-beer day for a multi-beer week with everything going on. But we're happy to be here, bringing you episode 4 of State of the Hack, live here from our FireEye office in Alexandria, Virginia. It's, I guess, 4 p.m. our time now. Yeah, we thanks for people that were able to figure out tuning in last month too. We tried to do a live stream from the RSA floor.
Right, had a little. We're security experts, not necessarily AV experts.
Yeah. But Alex Landstein joined us last month. So if you get the chance and you haven't checked it out, the video's on YouTube
and iTunes podcast.
Yeah. So
anyways, you need to introduce yourself. So.
I'm Nick Carr from the FireEye Advanced Practices team.
And I'm Christopher Glyer, the Chief Security Architect for FireEye.
So thanks for joining us. We want to get through a couple topics and start talking about sort of live in the wild campaigns we're responding to and bring on our guests. So let's just get started.
Sure.
We wanted to talk first about PwnAuth and the larger family of OAuth abuse attacks. So this is kind of an interesting topic that reaches a lot more people than they probably realize. Wanted to give you guys a little bit of background. So OAuth is this open protocol for secure authentication. These OAuth abuse attacks have been happening for some time. Basically, a victim authorizes a malicious application, obviously without knowing it, to have access to their profile on these online accounts. These accounts are things like Office 365, right. Corporate accounts or Gmail accounts, personal.
So if you're a bad guy, you create a malicious app in the Google, in Google and publish it, and then send a link to a user, a link in an email, and then asking to authorize that, their access to their account.
Yeah, and it's appropriate like a day before GDPR day, I think, to get into this kind of this world. This is seriously a big attack vector that people haven't paid that much attention to. So we're hoping to bring some attention to it with our tool release and some of the techniques we've provided out there. So the interesting part about OAuth attacks is these accounts, your personal account or work accounts that allow this the OAuth protocol. You'll get on and enable these applications that give access to bypass passwords or two-factor. So like if you have
two-factor is the real key there, right? Like,
exactly.
You may have two-factor. I mean, I put two-factor on all my accounts, and once you've authorized it, because it's using an API to access on the back end, it can access all your, emails, your contacts, et cetera.
Yes, and the crazy part, so in the targeted attacks we've seen, I want to talk about those for a minute or two, how we got there. This offline access provides attackers access for up to 90 days. And the only way you'd be able to know it, first of all, is to know something malicious is there, either revoke the application or change your password. Even in the instances of changing your password, the attacker still has access for up to an hour to your accounts. And we mean full access to email, contacts.
Yeah, full content.
Yeah. So, what makes these really interesting also is that all that consent happens on the provider's webpage. So all it takes is basically getting you to click the link. That's the most difficult part, I suppose, a lot of times with phishing. It comes in via phishing. You click a link and you're going to land on Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, other people's pages that basically say, do you authorize this application?
It's a secure link. It's actually Yahoo or Google or
everything in your phish is templated to look like those services, and then when you land, it's legitimately on those services pages too. So
and then every provider has different requirements of what they allow from the app. So in a couple of these cases, Google actually either does or still allows people to call your app Google something.
Yes.
Right.
So these targeted attacks, it says, will you allow Google Docs access, which that was an interesting example. And so it's pretty convincing. You can use whatever image. So anyways, did you want to give some background on when we first started seeing this?
So we first saw it in 2016. The APT28 was targeting a number of different persons and individuals and organizations associated with the, in the campaign in 2016.
Yep.
And so, we observed it during that. I remember when it first happened, we had probably 3 or 4 consultants that night.
It was fun.
Arguing over, is this malicious or not? It took a couple hours until we actually figured out what was happening and came to the conclusion that it was malicious. So if it took us several hours to figure that out, imagine kind of the person on the other side of that, the victim. I would hazard a guess most victims probably wouldn't be able to know that or figure that out.
Yeah, so we first talked about it in our M-Trends 2016 report in the section that covered APT 28 and 29. Some of that stuff is still pretty relevant today. And then there was some other coverage of the specific technique. Trend Micro put out their Pawn Storm report, and they talked about it being used against Yahoo and things like that. But I think the really interesting part is Glyer was able to trace it back to 2014, a technique shared by a researcher.
So I was Googling and found that it was a researcher who basically reported it to Google and said, found it, and then Google kind of reported back, well, functioning as designed.
That's right.
Everything's good here. So it is functioning as designed. It's just not necessarily, it enables malicious behavior. If you, granted, you have to allow and authorize the app. So I assume from their perspective, they asked you and you said yes. So,
that's right.
It's just that they allowed you to kind of dupe you in terms of the name and the logo that the app uses.
Yeah, so we have this 2014 activity from Andrew Cantino at Tectonic on Twitter. And then obviously the APT28 usage of that around 2016. Then in 2017, so no one seemed to pay that much attention in 2016. In 2017, in May, there was this Eugene Popov
there's a worm, right?
Worm. There was a Google Docs worm that spread out, and it was big on Reddit, and Google was responding.
Made it on CNN, and everyone was talking about it.
And they kind of everyone was hailed for their quick response to it. And it's interesting because that sort of brought it into wider...
the public consciousness at that point.
And since then, we've seen Google take a bunch of interesting steps, and some other service providers. I think Google is actually ahead of some of the other service providers with what they give you. But it's still a very difficult thing to identify in your organization. If your organization uses Office 365, it's hard for the administrators to audit all the applications that people might have connected. So we've released Doug Bienstock on our red team has still been using this. So since 2016 and then 2017, even with this outbreak, our red team's been using this tool with a lot of success.
Yeah.
So at some point, we wanted to spread larger awareness. So he's released the tool. It's got 2 components to enable this attack for organizations to test themselves. And then he released a bunch of scripts to help people hunt through it. The one thing I did want to say is, for watching this stuff in the wild for 2 years, this offline access, giving anyone access to 90 days of your email, your contacts, your documents shared on your cloud drives and stuff like that, I've been blown away at how difficult it is to identify evil activity from legit applications, because people seem to be very cavalier with allowing access. Just maybe they don't know, I think, providing all kinds of just one-off applications access to all of their stuff.
Well, and then you were telling me you were looking at applications and seeing what kind of apps were asking for access.
Yes.
And that's pretty scary at the level
of
certain apps have asked for access.
A comic book app that wants access to to be able to read all of your emails and all your documents. It felt very...
Totally legit.
Yes.
Totally legit.
It felt very, similar to the Cambridge Analytica situation, I think, where people weren't realizing where their information is going. So I really, we just encourage you to check out PwnAuth, understand a little bit more about OAuth attacks, and know that they've been used in the wild. We're going to keep using them on the red team to test, and we encourage everyone to
And the idea here is you have a tool that you can test yourself and your own security tools, et cetera, to see if you'd actually be able to detect it or prevent it in your tools.
Perfect. With that, we went a little long. We want to bring on Andrew Thompson. Is there an applause noise?
Yeah.
Hey! Uh-oh. Camera's pausing. There we go.
All right, we're back.
We're live.
Cheers. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Spread out a
So you
little
want to
bit.
introduce Andrew?
Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself?
Andrew Thompson.
Whoa.
I think we're having some interesting camera work. Andrew Thompson.
Gotta pay extra for that.
I work on the Adversary Pursuit sub-team of Advanced Practices, NITCAR. And pretty much my team spends our time pursuing adversaries, just like our name says, across the FireEye enterprise, to include beyond our customers' environments.
Awesome. And so internally, Andrew and the group, of the many things they do, one of the things they do is they join in on basically every incident response engagement, all of our managed defense customers and stuff like that. They're sort of in the trenches with us, riding shotgun on everything and helping out. And so we want to get into some of what that looks like, stories about how we do that, and definitely want to touch on a lot of how FireEye tracks and merges these different groups. So one other thing, though, because if you don't mind sharing just a tiny bit of your background, we got Memorial Day coming up, for people that want to break into the field, if you wanted to share any of your background.
Sure. So I actually started out as a Marine. Semper Fidelis. Got my start in the Corps as a 0311 infantry rifleman. Spent some time in Iraq, then decided to transition into the counterintelligence, human intelligence field. Spent some time in the Middle East doing that work, and then finished my time in a cyber organization where I performed a lot of the counterintelligence side, looking after some of the foreign intelligence threats that the Department of the Navy was facing.
Awesome. It's been, and how long have you been at FireEye?
I've been at FireEye about 11 months. So
Sweet. Man, it feels
just
a lot
got
longer.
here. Yeah,
Yeah.
certainly covered some ground since I've been here.
So I think one of the, I guess, more confusing areas, maybe for outsiders, is kind of how we track groups and clusters of activity, and then like our process of how we then collapse them and name them, and what we refer to internally as like uncategorized groups or ungroups. And so maybe you can kind of walk through and start people like from the beginning. Like we find something, what we would like, how do we know whether something's related to something that we have, or something we've never seen, or at least we're not sure?
Sure. So on my team, we track clusters of activity. So we are in direct support of our managed defense services as well as professional services mandate. And as they're conducting engagements, they're identifying indicators, and we are looking at our graph, trying to determine, is this something we've seen before? Is it similar to things that we've seen before? If we cannot determine immediately that it belongs within a existing cluster or threat group, such as an APT or financial group, then we'll go ahead and create what we call an UNC. And all an UNC means is just uncategorized. We haven't determined exactly what their motivations are yet at this point. We also haven't determined if they are an individual actor, a part of a larger threat organization, something that's well defined like APT 35 or Fin 7, for example.
So over the last year, as people have seen a bunch of APT releases, it's important that they know those all sort of start as these different clusters of UNC groups as we learn more about them. Certainly, obviously, if they're
And it may be
connected to
several
nation
years
state.
to go from like a group to
Yes.
like an actually formally designated APT group, right?
Absolutely.
Or Fin group for that matter.
Absolutely. So we've got UNCs that are still down in the double digits. So like UNC 39, for example. We've got a pretty good understanding of them, but we're still working to find that technical evidence that helps tie them into the advanced persistent threat that we associate them with.
And one of the things, obviously, is like a full understanding of the life cycle. What that really means is, being able to see what they do post-compromise and, what kind of data they're after and things like that. So it's obviously very tied to real incidents, things we're seeing on the managed services side and the managed defense side.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's really important because most of the stuff that we're putting out there is original source, right? So this typically is not stuff that we've researched. This is stuff that we're seeing in the trenches, so to speak. We've got Mandiant Consulting that are responding to hundreds of incident responses a year. In that, they're finding real-world activity. So it's not stuff that is necessarily coming from third-party open source reporting. It's firsthand knowledge of the adversaries that are affecting customers today.
So how do we decide to take, say, a cluster of activity that we're tracking, what we would call an ungroup, and then either promote that or merge that in with what type of information are you specifically looking for to say, like, okay, I'm confident, and actually, why are we so, why are we so careful and cautious with spinning up these new groups and tracking them, and like what's the concern there from your perspective?
Absolutely. So we don't want to muddy the waters. There's certainly tool reuse among many of these organizations, and so where we kind of look at it is what the distinguishing features of the actual threat actor are, and we're down to the point where we actually even track subgroups of defined organizations. So APT 10 might have 5 different subgroups, because we like to distinguish between individual operators if we get to that level, but usually there's a technical indicator or a group of technical indicators that helps us link that cluster to a particular group. And so we'll continue to track these clusters for years until we have the evidence that we need in order to merge them and then graduate them to an APT or a Fin group.
like, so one of the interesting things to me that I've learned is, as we sort of combined teams and worked more with these guys, is there's a lot of public reporting. There's a lot of great stuff out there. We'll get into some of the recent stuff where other companies are doing really great work. Something new comes in and attributed already, right? Maybe even attributed to something that we, an APT numbered group in the FireEye style. The interesting thing for me is seeing how that works out, right? Like, it comes in and it's sort of an UNC unless we immediately see any overlaps. It's going to spin up. That's an uncategorized cluster until we can merge that in. And so it's a very dynamic process that's pretty cool to be close to. And I mean, it's a pretty unique.
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly are looking at open source reporting. A lot of vendors are putting out great stuff. They might have visibility at a particular intrusion that we weren't called for. And so we will track that as a separate cluster. And so commonly we are asked, hey, what is your equivalent of this named group from a separate vendor? And that gets dicey for us. We have 4 or 5 what we call UNCs that are associated with that. And we can do some sort of analysis, make some conclusions, but we really want to see that actual technical overlap before we actually go ahead and merge them in. This is really big with the Iranian groups that we see. There's a lot, between, we've got, I think, 4 or 5 UNCs that people would report out, or Greenbug, Cattle Spy. There's a number of other vendor names out there for some of the clusters that we're tracking, but we like to keep them separate until we have definitive evidence that they are a part of the same APT.
I think we've been doing better responding to feedback online, and the social team has been engaged when people like, we don't quite understand what this group is. We try to at least make those statements now in the blogs and various releases saying this particular cluster might overlap with public reporting on this area, but we try to be really clear about that, and there's a lot of nuance. So I did want to mention one thing too, because I think Richard Baitlich was asking about the named temp groups, because that's something he wasn't used to during his time here. And so my understanding, the temp dot something named is sort of when we discuss those uncategorized clusters in an fashion. If we send something on our private iSight portal, or things are shared, if we sort of want to share some of those techniques those attackers are using, if it's not associated with an APT group and you're hearing about it, you're probably not going to hear an UNC. I think we'll be in trouble.
Sure. Yeah. So we don't actually discuss UNCs typically in any products that we provide to customers. This is probably one of the first times that we've talked about UNCs publicly. But as far as like temp groups are concerned, the thing that's important intelligence work, there's an assessment that goes along with that, right? And so our folks in IT are able to then make assessments with some degree of confidence, whether that's high confidence, moderate confidence, et cetera. That enables them to continue to put out intelligence products in their portals for the consumers, while still maintaining some level of caveat to the information they're putting out there. Basically, we want to make sure that that valuable information is reaching our customers, but we want to make sure that we're caveating with our level of confidence in it before we put it out there.
So the interesting thing from kind of an incident responder's perspective is this kind of creates I guess a natural tension between IR teams in the field and your kind of technical intelligence teams that are supporting you, because you, especially if you've been around a long time and you've seen all the TTPs, and like you kind of just have a feel. You're like, okay, I know this is APT 10, or I know this is APT 3, or and a lot of times the first inclination of your technical intelligence team will be to, well, we're going to spin up a new cluster of activity, I'm really sure, and then you kind of almost have to prove it to them, or like kind of convince them or work with them to help kind of lead them to get to the place where we can actually collapse that. But I know it's an interesting it's interesting to see, or at least have experienced that on kind of both sides. I certainly understand why you guys take the maybe level of rigor that you need to.
Sure.
But it kind of does create, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is the team has a very high standard that we have to meet before we'll put our names on stuff we're putting out there, right? And so the Mandiant consultants are pros. These guys have decades of experience, so they're very familiar with the threat actors, and And we are constantly having that conversation, actually, and it's to our benefit because those are what I would consider hot leads. I know where to go look in order to find evidence at least to support that conclusion. But certainly we will not actually declare a threat group defined until we actually have some kind of technical backing to it. And it's not going to be one thing typically. We need to see overlap in infrastructure, TTPs, et cetera.
It's so interesting to watch their real-time activity, and that's what you're doing. You
Right.
feel like you are very intimate and understand the attacker, and then conveying that is a skill set that is very interesting. It's something I'm still learning, and I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how you back that up with technical artifacts in a way that makes sense, that we can share, and something I guess we're always working on. Is there any recent observable overlaps or merges that you would be interested in sharing? I know some of it is sometimes sensitive, but curious if you have any kind of stories of recent activity.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell a recent story that's actually in with what we were just discussing. So our managed defense responded to a particular intrusion very quickly, identified it early, and the guy that was looking at it was very familiar with APT-10. He was like, hey, this is APT-10. I feel good about it. I'm like, okay, great. We weren't able to attribute it at that exact moment. Fast forward a month later, our Mandiant consultants were responding to an intrusion with a live threat actor. And eventually we saw enough technical overlap not only to attribute that particular response, but the operator actually screwed up in some of his host commands. And we were able to link it to the managed defense intrusion that we were looking at a month prior. And so that was pretty awesome to be able to go from different business lines and attribute that activity in one fell swoop.
Nice. Retroactive identification of it. Hey, we're hearing that the streaming is a little bit spotty, so we apologize up front. Again, we will upload videos to YouTube, so we're going to go ahead and keep going here. And iTunes. So we'll keep going here locally. If it cuts up, I apologize. We'll try to send out links so people can share it. But we want to spend some time with Andrew and talk about some of the recent activity. Again, the reason we're on multiple beers here, the VPN filter activity.
Right.
I want to chat a little bit about that as we get into this activity roundup area. So we spun up our community protection events, which we've talked about a couple times here. When there's notable global events, the team spins up and gets a lot of people together that are going to analyze it and just a little focus cell to work 24/7 on a particular event. Did you want to give people some overview of the Talos activity?
So first off, kudos to them. I think they put out a really well thought out and detailed blog post with great technical indicators, detailed malware analysis. So kudos to them for
shout out to the Beers with Talos podcast too, because those guys do it up nicely.
So we took a look at what they published and started to look for that within our own product telemetry. So far, as you would expect. So this is a threat actor who's targeting basically home office VPN devices and QNAP network attached storage devices, and trying to create a botnet largely based in Ukraine. Given recent tensions between Ukraine.
You said home office, just sort of consumer level.
Yeah, consumer level
router.
grade, like D-Link and Netgear and
Interesting.
Those kinds of things.
So maybe some networking equipment might be used in other places,
It could
not
be
necessarily home office.
Yeah, I mean
specifically.
We haven't seen and Talos and I haven't seen anybody else talk about kind of the motivations behind the threat. I think there's a lot of speculation right now that it might be related to either the upcoming the Champions League tournament is in or finals is in Kiev this weekend. So that could be a reason or motivation behind wanting to have a destructive attack in Ukraine. A lot of the devices and routers were in Ukraine specifically.
Or a particular holiday coming up that was
There's a holiday
busy
coming up
last year,
right,
as I recall.
Yep. And so so we've looked across our telemetry and I think the number of victims within our product set's probably in the single digits, and that's to be expected because most of our customers are corporations or enterprises, and they're not going to have a lot of like home office devices or routers, et cetera. You'd expect them to have different type of devices. But what's interesting is the telemetry, well, you and I were both up late last night. The earliest of the most recent activity we can see is from March 22nd of 2018. And from, if you look at, I think Kaspersky talked about, some passive DNS in one of their blog about seeing it go back to February and January of 2018. Well, and this will probably be new. We haven't been able, it's kind of late breaking stuff, but we do have product detection. So one of the components was it would actually reach out to a public website called PhotoBucket. It would download and some kind of steganography, would look up like the EXIF header.
Yeah,
and
I
parse
looked
it.
in the EXIF data, I think, for the geolocation info,
And then it would turn
use
that
for
into
the
an IP address for it to connect
awesome.
to. And then
Yep.
if that wasn't available, it would then connect to a hard-coded domain and do a similar thing. Is we actually have product detections from our network sensors that detected this activity. We just didn't know it back in 2016. I think it was October of 2016. At
Sort
one
of
our,
generic detections, but
yeah, generic detections of the connecting to the PhotoBucket site in October of 2016, and in an Eastern European organization. And so I thought that was, we just found that
yes.
data, and what's interesting about some of our technologies, we often have detections of things that we don't necessarily understand the connection and the relevance of it until maybe much later.
Right.
And so this is, I think, one of those examples where at least a portion of the infrastructure, maybe it was reused or there was something else to do with it, but the PhotoBucket activity, some of the actual technical indicators that Talos provided, we see going back to 2016. So there you go.
Yes.
Some it's late breaking new information being shared here with you guys. That's not anywhere public yet. So.
And with the team, with Andrew's whole team, looking at some of the code overlaps and having our great Flare analysts look at the reuse of RC4 functions and the particular keys and some of that stuff. So it's so layered when you try to add on the technical intelligence on top of it and the telemetry. It's cool to build that picture and spend the time to do that internally and share that out. So we share it out with customers. We always like to try to share it a little bit broader too. So hope to share more of that story.
Yep.
And just overall network device targeting is.
Yeah, it's really been on the uptick recently.
Yep.
We've seen lots of different cases of being targeted. The challenge is if you can break into especially routers, they sit outside of your between your infrastructure and the internet, and
right.
all your security devices and tools are usually just behind that, maybe sitting on for firewall or something else. So most organizations, there aren't products that can either protect or do security monitoring of those devices. If they are infected, how would you know it?
Right.
Either because there's not a security product monitoring it, and it's not behind one. So your ability to actually monitor that. I did hear at least recently of one capability. There's someone told me about a SolarWinds capability where you can connect it to like your routers and switches, and it'll basically check the hash of the device basically every hour, and then diff it and tell you if it changes. So that's the most
cool.
proactive thing that I've heard so far of any organization, at least so we'll tip it there.
Sweet. I mean, yeah, stuff on the rise. I'm a little bit out of sleep given just the overall critical infrastructure targeting. My background in ICS CERT and our ICS and SCADA team, always busy. Coming off of the Triton stuff, I did want to mention that Dragos put out a notice about some more activity. So the attackers behind Triton, Trisis, have been they've been busy on the IT network side and getting on. And there's some indication as they put out. I encourage you to check that out about targeting some other safety instrumentation systems. So. Second beer, sorry. I'm struggling through the SIS. So yeah, there's just there's a lot going on, a lot to keep pace with. It's an interesting time to be doing what we're doing, I suppose.
Yeah, I'll be curious as more public reporting comes out about the technical indicators and from those breaches. But ICS attacks certainly aren't going away, and if anything, they're getting more prevalent, not less prevalent. So I'd expect there to be information shared, hopefully, about what that might look like with other vendors, whether it's Honeywell or Emerson or Yokogawa or whomever they're targeting. It's more than just Schneider Electric, which was the initial or the first go around with Triton.
Yeah, and if you spend a little bit of time with it, it's certainly very impressive. That's one of the things I hope we've shared through this series. Sort of authentic appreciation of how detailed these attacks are. The data and steganography, we love that stuff. sorry, but we kind of like the really advanced stuff that gets by things that we look at, and it's part of what keeps it exciting and interesting. And the one thing I did want to talk about was WMI activity. That's a broad category. It didn't used to be, but there's been a couple things recently that have been going on. I wanted to pick your brain on at least one of them, because I think we've seen a couple attack groups use WMI. So we've seen WMI persistent scriptlets. We've seen this technique drop all the way down, right? Using the system uptime technique within scriptlets, this basic bypass, script-based bypass, that's using a technique that traces way back. We shared online some of the background about it. It's kind of fun. Matt Graber was chiming in because he was involved in some of it. But seeing the system uptime basically checking for how long the system had been booted for, 240 to 310 or something is the range people go at, to make sure it's reliably booted up, and then it runs. It also changes some forensic artifacts. I guess I'll leave it at high level. Check out our WMI white paper. But that was cool, and we first saw that technique with APT29, again, responding to those guys. Graber put it out in PowerSploit. It was included in some Vault 7 leaks and some other stuff. And then now we've just seen it trickle down. It's neat to see the TTP stuff come down. But you also chimed in.
Yeah.
Everyone looks at your 2015 presentation about there's something about WMI.
Right.
With Devin Kerr.
And so, so Devin and I were working on a project for a client of ours, and they got hit 4 different times by 4 different threat actors in 6 months. So Devin and I worked really closely with this particular victim, and so one of the threat actors is who we now call Periscope, was in a group at the time, or is in a group, and we were analyzing a system that got infected, and we saw a .mof file get dropped on the system, and had no idea what it was. This is back in several years ago, where we were then doing the pre all the 29 activity and everything else. So we then had to do a bunch of research figuring out what is WMI, how does it work, and so then that spawned the research papers, that spawned the conferences that we talked about, and then our ability to then find it within, say, Mandiant Consulting at scale, to then, which enabled us so that we could then look for proactively to see, and that's actually how we found 29 using it. So it's kind of interesting that it actually got started with a Chinese nation-state group and some of their more advanced techniques that they use that spawned a whole cottage industry and set of research, which now it's a much more publicly available technique.
Sweet. Well, I think we're running up a little bit on time, but if there's any other recent stories, if there's anything you want to share, I know your team's hiring as well, always, so if you want to work with these guys, highly recommend it. We always need good people. But has there been any recent activity, too, you wanted to throw out there that sparked your interest?
Yeah, so especially we had to start late, I just wanted to throw a couple of things out there. I know that people have this big concern that who-is information is going to be a thing of the past, and on our team, we're constantly looking to develop additional sources and methods in order to actually identify threat actors. And when I mean identify threat actors, I mean prior to their actual actions at a particular target. So one example that I can come up with fairly recently is a UNC that we loosely assesses Iranian threat group. And funny enough, we've been able to track their infrastructure for months now. And we're not using who-is records to, right? One example, and I'll throw the domain out for you guys.
What?
Just as I'll throw the domain out. So rdppath.com. You'll go ahead and you'll look that little guy up. Anyways, so the story with that is we identified it at day 0, within hours of them establishing the infrastructure. We found the server before we found the actual domain. And so 2 days after they set up that infrastructure, we actually saw the first sample hit virus total. Was what we refer to as quad agent. Pretty interesting PowerShell tool that they use. But 2 days after they established their infrastructure, that sample hit virus total from supposedly a Pakistani uploader. We haven't seen that particular threat group action too much against our customers, which is pretty interesting. I'm raring to go on it because we own guys. So if you're watching, yeah,
Perfect.
learn how to obscure the rest of your infrastructure. I guess we'll find you still.
We got you. So good.
All right. Well, I think it's probably good to sign off on that.
Yeah.
And, we'll give a cheers. Catch us next month on State of the Hack.
You got it. Cheers.